Welcome to tonight's PATCA webinar. My name is Sean Murphy, and I'll be acting as the voice of the audience. PATCA is famous for its interactive sessions, and I ask you to use the chat feature to pose questions as we go, and I will stir them into the presentation as appropriate. We are fortunate tonight to get a briefing on wearable skin patches that stay put from JoAnne Moody. JoAnne has more than 25 years of experience in medical device development. She provides technical expertise, fresh insights, and solutions to challenging adhesive and plastics bonding and joint design problems. She is the principal consultant and president of Zeta Scientific, where she pursues her passion for solving material science problems for companies that range in size from startups to Fortune 500 enterprises. She trains teams to overcome hurdles, helping them to move more products forward. She has a broad range of experience that encompasses R&D, process, testing, scale up, product transfers, and low to high volume manufacturing. Prior to founding Zeta Scientific, she worked at firms such as 3M, Boston Scientific, Endosonics Corporation, Raycam, now known as TE Connectivity, and Liquidity Nanotechnology Corporation. She has a BA in chemistry from Hamline University and a master's in chemical engineering and material science from the University of Minnesota. Ladies and gentlemen, JoAnne Moody.
All right, well, thanks for the introduction. And I'm very much looking forward tonight to go over this presentation I put together on wearable device skin patches that stay put. So my outline is here. We'll go through an overview to get everybody on the same page. I have some great examples of wearables to look over and understand a little bit more about the adhesive used in them. We'll go through the product development cycle that could be used for wearable device and design with the skin patches. Then I have some case studies of real life development and problems that you run into. And finally, we'll have some takeaways. So what's a wearable device? That's your first question. And the way we're defining it tonight is that it is a device that is an electronic device. It's worn near the body, on the body, and it's measuring some type of parameter or multiple parameters, collecting real-time data. So the data will be transmitted to a smartphone, a cloud, or other device storage mediums. And as most of us know, the wearable devices are very widespread in a lot of different markets. The largest market is really the lifestyle and fitness market, very huge. But this presentation will be focusing on the medical application side of the wearables. So a lot of trends going on. I think many of us are aware of them, but the first one is that really the measurements in health parameters are just skyrocketing, with looking at the heart rhythms, temperature, diabetes, and more. And with the miniaturization, new sensors, and materials technologies, we are just going to see many more possibilities in the wearable devices in the near and long term. The COVID pandemic, though, was a real push towards telemedicine, and as we'll go through a couple of devices, they really skyrocketed specifically over the pandemic. So I'd like to go over some of the form factors. I think we've even mentioned a couple here in the beginning that we have a lot of different ways we can locate a form to get the data. And the first one, I think most of us are aware of, are the wristbands. And if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you to go into your chat, and I'm doing a little poll to see how many of us have a smartwatch. And so go ahead and say yes if you do, if you could. So of course, I'm looking at the smartwatches, the bands and the rings, as all a band style of wearable. And they are, again, from a form factor standpoint, they're still very significant. They do have some disadvantages, and we'll learn more about some of those. Another new area.
JoAnne, your answers were no, yes, no, Fitbit, no.
Okay.
So we have we were less on the smartwatch side.
Okay, that's okay. All right. Great. That kind of tells me where we're at. So we're going to then take another question, just one more. How many of you have had experience wearing a medical device with a skin patch on it? this will kind of help me tune the talk a little bit here.
So one yes, one does IV count? Does a wearable IV count?
Yeah, you know, like I said, that's where I'm starting out with my definition being with electronic device.
Electronic,
But in fact, we could still broaden the definition a little bit because you've had experience then with a skin patch.
PIC line. Heart detection, yes. So quite a few actually.
All right. Okay. Okay. So from the standpoint of locations and these different form factors, I think what's rather interesting is that with the skin patches, if you think about it, they can pretty much go any place on your body. And you can't say that about the bands. And so that's a real driving force to some of the increased use of the skin patches, that you can put in more places. And look at all the places that the wearables are on right now, over on the right side here, from wrist, head, neck, stomach, legs, finger, hands, you name it, just a lot of locations. So that's where the skin patch has a lot of good attributes. Another area though that, and from a form factor that's going to continue to increase, would be the ear pods or devices in the ear, the electronic clothing or the e-textile type of applications. They're working on those as well. So we'll see how that moves forward, as well as the glasses. So this kind of just gives us a view of our options on the wearables, and it helps us with some of our definitions. So I'll move on now to compare some of the pros and cons that I see between bands and adhesive patches. So what I show here now is at the beginning of looking at monitoring. Many of the monitoring, the measurements are more accurate when directly attached to the skin. So even though we're measuring heart rate, glucose monitoring, core temperature, and when we use the patch, we get a little bit more accurate than we would if we attempted to with a band. And right now there are no products that measure glucose, for example, using a band. So as far as the disadvantages of adhesive patches, we do have a skin sensitivity issue and potential trauma that can occur. So although that is one of the bigger disadvantages, also the bands have had skin sensitivity issues. There was a recall a number of years ago on an early Fitbit, and they had to bring the devices back. The bands had materials that caused sensitivity, and that was reported and returns were made. So this again gives you a feel of some of the pros and cons, and to set the stage for us moving into talking more about the adhesive side. And along with the adhesive side, the compliance becomes a special issue. We're adding a new material to the device, and many of the adhesives, if you took an off-the-shelf adhesive in a hardware store, you definitely could not use that on the body. So they have to go through the same requirements as other medical materials, using the main regulatory bodies that we all know about, the FDA and ISO. And early on, many of the devices are going to be class 2 if they're going to be, the data is going to be used directly to determine next medical steps. So the diagnostic side is 2. Many of the devices are moving in that direction. Even if they're not ready yet, they're trying to get the materials ready. The sterilization methods that are typical for devices with adhesive are the irradiation methods, as well as ethylene oxide. And then the final standard, the ISO 10993 for biocompatibility, is a very important one that we'll go over when you want to be real careful to be using it, and especially in the area of extraction and leaching types of tests. This becomes an important standard for us to follow. So now we're going to move on to those examples. We're going to first start out with the continuous monitoring patch. So the continuous glucose monitoring patch is something that means that you can be a diabetic and you don't have to do skin pricks. Now this device will attach to your skin. Let's see here, let me get my arrow here to show you that there's a small needle that will penetrate your skin. And it's a very, in some cases, you apparently are not supposed to feel it. It's got to be a fairly durable adhesive here attached to the skin, and you're able to get your blood sample from the interstitial fluid, and these little blue dots here would be the glucose that is measured, and the levels can be measured and tracked every several minutes, or as designed by this particular application. So what's really great about this is that you're able to monitor the trend of your glucose, not just a few measurements during the day. And that trend can really help diabetics. And from a standpoint, though, what's happened since the pandemic is that this monitor was approved for reimbursement, at least a few of the manufacturers, so that in the room, in the intubation rooms, even now in the operating rooms, the doctors and the nurses are able to look at the glucose at the nurse station before walking in the room. So this has made it safer and more effective for the patient and the essential workers to work with patients that are ill and happen to be diabetic and need to have the glucose monitoring going on. So this has caused quite an increase in the usage of these devices. And in fact, there are companies a bit worried right now about scaling up in the next year or two. The quantities are going to need to continue to grow this product market. In addition to that, it appears that this device will also be useful, more of a biofeedback for those that are not diabetic and are interested in improving their health by measuring their glucose easily. So this is one of the top winners over the COVID in terms of a medical device, has been this one. For looking at the cardiac monitoring, I think some of you have had the stick-on monitors that, for this particular case, is a Zio EKG patch by iRhythm that will measure and record in the device the function of the heart, and then the device, this particular one, is sent off for evaluation, and other ones will go directly to a database. But this is a very, very useful one. And then the third one I wanted to show, mainly because there was a child involved, is that the body temperature monitoring device is best done on the core body. And for this particular one, on a baby or a child, the skin is very sensitive and the wear time is fairly short, but it's a very important monitoring tool. And imagine if this baby was prematurely born and needed to have its body temperature monitor other parts, that sensitivity even increases further with a premature baby. And so that's a different type of application requiring special consideration for not damaging the skin of such a tiny baby. So we're going to now transition into looking at skin and some of the product development factors. So skin is quite a fascinating substrate. Having worked in adhesives for so many years, I'm used to the plastics, the metals, the ceramics that I stick to. But when you start working with the skin, it is it's alive. It's live. It's something very, very different to stick to. So the first concern has to do that your skin being live, it rejuvenates the surface of the skin every few weeks. So now your skin is sloughing off cells and you're trying to stick to that surface. So that especially is a really limitation on how long we'll be able to get things to stick to skin. And that's pretty much a long-term reality. And then as far as sensitivity, the most sensitive skin happens to be with the very old and the very young, where the skin happens to be thinner, more delicate. And so that requires, again, a certain type of adhesive that is able to handle and keep trauma low. The surface conditions are critical of the skin and when you're using them for your substrate, because you've got skin that can be oily, dry, textured, it can have hair on it. And so you have quite a bit of variation in your skin surface and texture. Then one of the factors that I'll go into in depth just in a moment will be the surface energy of the skin. So when we work with adhesion to substrates, what we do is we look at surface energy, and I'll go, it looks like it's a couple of slides down, where you know that bonding to, like, Teflon is very difficult. Well, bonding to skin is also very difficult. Another part of the skin that's important to be aware of is the stretchiness of the skin or the flexibility of the skin. So that, imagine the difference between the bottom of your foot and skin on your arm. So quite a bit difference in what we need to look at, as well as the location of the body part. Again, is it contoured, is it flat? In looking at a product development checklist, this doesn't show you all the phases, but it shows you that there's more complexity in developing a device with an adhesive. So not only do you need to, of course, understand your application, but the actual device, as well as the skin, this has to go together And early on, we need to understand the interaction of that with the adhesive. So of course, you're looking at regulatory, and especially you're also looking at removal and preparation properties. So this is a full list, and that will help you put together a more successful project plan by being sure you address these items early. Especially, I like to say that test criteria is often neglected, and you wait till you make the product, and early before making the product, you really ought to know how you're going to test it. You really ought to think about that and develop tests early on. A few adhesive definitions that I wanted to go over just to put us on the same page again. These sticky adhesives are typically called pressure sensitive adhesives, PSAs, and that they're very good at bonding dissimilar surfaces. So that's why we can bond, in some cases, skin and another substrate together, and you just use a very light pressure to stick it to the surface. The tack is the term that we use about the stickiness. So that's the ability of the adhesive to form the initial bond. And there's different levels of tack on adhesives. And in certain areas, to hold on longer, you probably need more tack, for example. When the shear adhesion is the resistance of the adhesive to flow. So let's imagine you've got the device on your arm, and it's there vertical. And so there's a certain amount of strength in the shear direction that has to occur, or the device will flow, and the adhesive will flow and the device will start to fall off. Peel adhesion is the force that required to peel the patch away. And in the case that's interesting for a skin adhesive, is you want the adhesive to cleanly remove from the skin. You don't want to leave adhesive behind. However, if you were working on an assembly, a medical assembly with surfaces, or a car, or other products that you use adhesives, you don't want them to peel cleanly. You want them to stay together. And if they peel at all, you want the adhesive to split in the middle. Well, you certainly don't want that with this type of a product. So that's why that's another part of failure mode analysis that fits into looking at adhesives. So this is back now to the surface energies and the wettability. To show you where skin fits here, it's right in terms of difficult to bond to, right next to fluoropolymers. So it's a tough one. And so for testing purposes, what do? Well, you do go ahead and you do test as soon as you can with skin in humans in your team. And there also are those synthetic skins available, and some of them are listed in patents, and they're available, as well as you could use another substrate such as the polyethylene, lower high density polyethylene during product development, but nonetheless it won't have the same texture as skin. So these are some of the challenges, and the surface energy, again, is something to know about as you work with adhesives. So I'm looking now at a whole range of adhesives that are actually used in wearables. So you've got a lot of choices. So you really need to kind of narrow in early on how to start to get to the right family of adhesives for your application. The first two on the list are the most common. So the acrylic adhesive is a pretty high volume product or adhesive used in many applications. It's super good at bonding to dissimilar surfaces. It's very good. It has a range of properties you change with its chemistry. So the manufacturers have special formulations that can be low tack, high tack. They breathe, they can be repositioned, but they do have a couple issues. One is they can tend to have some skin trauma issues, and that needs to be looked at. As also, when you put them down on the skin, it's not as completely instant stick. It might take 6 or 7 minutes to develop a better adhesion, or even a few hours. So there's a time issue on an acrylic achieving its highest adhesion. So the silicone gels, though, are really low trauma, very good initial tack. And those are the ones that are tending to be used more and more for that low trauma. So that would be, the infants, the delicate skin, but they're difficult actually to bond to another substrate to make the device. So they've got that issue. They are higher cost, shorter wear time than the acrylics, and a thicker silicone will not be very breathable. So some design considerations on perforations and different sorts of backings are needed to allow for to breathe while of course, you do sweat. So this is always an issue with sweat. And then I've got the other adhesives that are used. And I think one I wanted to mention would be the hydrocolloid. It's very interesting because it will stick to wet skin, but it doesn't really have much strength. The last one I wanted to mention, which is a newer one, is starting to compete now. This would be the polyurethanes and the gels, starting to compete with the silicones because it is easier to bond to. It is cheaper. It has low tack, but it also because it's a newer formulation, there are some unknowns potentially in the chemistry and any skin trauma I'm not as sure of, because it's pretty new in this application.
So JoAnne, when you say low tack, that
Yeah.
means it doesn't stick very well when initially applied.
Well, low tack is stickiness of the adhesive.
So low is not very sticky.
Yeah, it's low tack, not very sticky. Yep, that's what that means. And so silicone gel is, like I said, silicones are very interesting because they stick very quickly, but they tend to be lower tack and shorter life. You know, it's an interesting trade-off. They instantly get the adhesion level. It's just because they're a little more soft, so more comfortable, you know, and they sort of kind of flow into the texture of the skin better right away.
And just one more maybe basic question. So how does breathability, how does that come into play, or what are the implications of high versus low breathability?
Well, when you're in all of them, there's a breathability factor. It has to be looked at because we do sweat, you know. And so what is done is they try to develop a way to have, they look at moisture vapor transmission measurements of the adhesive, right? As well as they incorporate ways for perforations or design changes to allow some breathability in the device and through the adhesive.
And so that's mainly about getting water vapor from sweat away from the skin.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So sometimes you're going to find some products that have a foam so that the moisture gets into the foam, you know, and it stays there.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So I could talk a long time on these adhesives, but that's just a quick summary. But like I said, you have a lot of selection choices and quite a few vendors as well. So I'm going to move on to some, I call them case studies, or at least some specific sort of areas of issues you can run into or challenges as you're working on bringing up a wearable product with adhesives. And I'm first going to start with, where do you start? You know, so after you've come up with a mock-up, you want to come up with a mock-up early on, which would simulate the weight and size of your sensor and its package. And so that you could then use that actual device or a mock-up piece that would simulate at least the weight and the size. And with that, you're going to know from your skin requirements and your device requirements, you'll get some clue on some of the families of adhesives that you'll want to try to test and learn about early on. And you'll also see on this mock-up that the tape is a bit exaggerated, but it's wider than the device, because often on these devices, if you put the tape right under the device, it's going to lift up there. There's no flexibility. So they often call this a skirt or sometimes, so that's a little bit exaggerated, but that is a common part of the feature of your mock-up. So you have your device, you have your sticky PSA tape, but then you have some way you've got to bond that tape to your device. So there's either another adhesive, in certain configurations, there'll be a couple layers, there'll be some heat bonding. There's different ways to make this tie layer. Very often on a prototype like this though, what you would do is, again, use another type of tape as a tie layer. So as you come up with your prototype design that will help you with adhesive screening, you find the right tapes for evaluation, and then you do your tests on either human skin or other, as I said, low energy substrates that would simulate skin, at least the bondability issue you run in with wetting of the adhesive on the skin. Then you go through and you say, well, I want this to last a certain amount of time. You evaluate the adhesive at different time periods, or you wait till it fails. And at that point, with your criteria you've already developed, you're going to rank your adhesives and what you've learned. And especially you're going to look at the failure mode. Did you have clean transfer of the tape off the skin when you wanted it to come off, or did you have residue left behind? And these would be part of understanding failure mode. Failure mode is it's one of the key elements of understanding adhesive development is you actually create failure modes on purpose in development. So for example, at a certain time period, even if the device hasn't come off, you're going to need to see what happens to it because it's time to come off, let's say. So this is part of your challenge, and one of your challenges in early on screening adhesives. And you'll go through also additional development steps to come up with this PSA tape and liner is a very oversimplified view of what you might end up with for adhering to your mock-up device. Some of them have little rings of adhesive. Like I say, you might have perforated layers, multi-layers foam, non-woven materials. There's a whole variety of configurations, but this is just a simple one to how to screen for your adhesive. So I'm going to then move on. If there are any questions.
I guess one question. So,
yeah.
For example, there are mechanical testing labs that will do like UL certification. They'll do drop tests. Are there equivalent standards for different categories of these wearable devices that are attached with adhesive?
There are some certain standards that are for this, and they're similar to regular stripes, but there are some other standards that are.
Are there labs that provide specialized testing, or
yeah, there are labs that do that as well. Yes.
Okay.
But again, it's really important. No matter what lab you may use, I feel it's really important for whoever is developing this to rudiment. This is the most fundamental thing to do early on, so that you can help that lab. You still end up customizing tests for your product in the end. So this is something I like to encourage people to do, but there are some labs that do this. There are some of the companies will help you, but what happens in the development of these products is that you actually really need to know how you're going to approach the manufacturing pretty early on, because that makes a difference on what type of a vendor you want to work with. Like, so there's a whole range of people out there that some would love to get involved and make your whole product, and some will send you to people to work with. And there's just a range of different ways that you can develop your product. And so it's important to focus on really early on that manufacturing step, which I had in the checklist, really critical.
Cool, thank you.
Yep. So yeah. Any other questions on this? Okay, because I'm going to move on now to a couple other case studies of when things go wrong. The first one will be with a continuous glucose monitor. Very typical problem. The device patch falls off prematurely. It's supposed to last a week or 14 days, and it doesn't make it through your shower, or it just doesn't make it, doesn't work for you. So your typical solutions, of course, are look at the instructions, right? But hopefully you've followed them, and it's but typically a few things just to pay special attention to. The skin not being dry. Now that's a pretty common thing to happen. And if it's not clean, or you hope it's clean, has to be clean and dry, because skin preparation, again, for a substrate must be done consistently. So it's really critical that is very uniform with the person using the device. Another thing that can go wrong is that this device is supposed to be long-term. And for a device that's going to be on for a day or two, and hopefully that's going to work fine. But this one, you're trying to maximize its life on your skin. So in all devices, you must be not just put it on your body and just tap it. You actually want to press it in such a way it's uniformly pressed, and also allow enough set time for that adhesive to really gain good adhesion to the skin. And manufacturers should give you some guidance on that. But for example, I know that some places will say, well, if you're going to use one of these patches, use this type. Well, put it on at night. You're dry and you have time. You're sleeping. You're not moving around too much. So that might improve its adhesion. Then of course there's the hair issue. That's a big issue. It is, what do you do if you remove the hair? It grows back, and so there's reasons that some manufacturers have come up with different places to put patches. So for example, on this device, some manufacturers say you can put it on your arm. Some have it on your stomach. So there's going to be perhaps even a personal preference on attachment based on hair.
Is there any Is there any other preparation that's done to the skin? Is there like a ethyl alcohol wipe or
But yeah,
isopropyl
they have,
alcohol?
yes, on the cleaning procedure, often it's soap and they might have some different wipes. Some don't want to use too much alcohol. So there's some different preferences on that. Often so there'll be a cleaning instruction, but often it's soap and water.
Okay.
But then people will start to use the alcohol wipes and that can over dry the skin. Now you're going to start to have you got to be so careful with these long-term wear products that you start to sensitize your own skin from, let's say, too much cleaning, too much drying. So one of the things to kind of address that question also is that in some cases, aside from trying to avoid water or dealing with that first initial application, is that there are some ways of covering the device with a waterproof patch. And in addition to that, there are some sprays that form a layer on your skin, a protective layer, and you can apply that and then apply your device. And then there's also other tapes that they recommend you put on your skin first, if you can believe, to get a better surface for their device to stick to. So these are some of the other things you'll find that people are doing to improve the adhesion to their skin. The other solution would be to try another manufacturer's product with a different adhesive, of course, So this is a real issue: is how do you make these things stay on long and use them for long-term use? And so it's a really important one. So I'm going to move on to the third case study of, again, same product, but this time again the long-term use will tend to lead to potentially not just skin irritation, but with what is called allergic contact dermatitis. So I found two case studies in the literature, two different manufacturers, and they're, some of the there's 4 big manufacturers of this product, and this is from two different ones. I mean, I know it's unintentional, but there were a few cases reported. It wasn't big enough for a recall, but they did do some pretty serious chemistry studies on a couple of these products to do leaching studies and to analyze all the chemicals that came out of it. And they could prove in one case that the reaction was caused by an additive to the acrylic adhesive. It's a common additive called isobornyl acrylate, used in almost all of the adhesives that are acrylics. And so that was found. And now, people are trying to use acrylics without that in a particular component. Another one was due to a skin reaction due to an assembly adhesive. Okay, so the assembly adhesive was an ethyl cyanoacrylate, which is a super glue, a fast curing adhesive that all of us have used. And someplace in the assembly, not next to the skin, but in another layer, they had used a cyanoacrylate. And had a few cases of reporting people with skin reactions, and they found that particular ingredient in another layer caused it. So what are the solutions then for these things? Well, like I said, one of them was reformulations, protective films and coatings. In this case, with the ethyl cyanoacrylate, they completely got rid of that and changed design, a completely different design. But from a development standpoint, what can you do about that? And that's where that ISO 10993 is actually very useful for helping us with certain tests, such as the extraction and leaching tests, which normally are performed on the finished device. And what you want to be sure to do in the development of this type of device is someplace if you've frozen your material design and close to freezing your manufacturing, you're going to want to get some of these leaching tests performed. Or some people actually do them a little too early. You really want them on your final materials. They don't have to be, completely manufacturable, but that's really important. You may end up repeating this a few times. And there are some very good test labs that do this all the time. And the last thing is that, again, manufacturers would really like to prevent these things from happening in the first place. Back to putting in enough effort into your project to work on materials is what I highly recommend. And that's a real study there. That's a picture of an arm. I actually wasn't sure what I was looking at first, but the dermatitis photos here. So some of the takeaways tonight were that we were going to show some of the usefulness of these new devices that use skin attachments, skin patch attachments. So they give you accuracy. They can be located in many different parts of the body. But of course, there are some significant challenges with the skin sensitivity and durability. So this is going to continue to be a limiting factor in development, but nonetheless, they've made great strides in this area. And again, if early on in your product development, you do the right testing on human subjects, you can greatly reduce some of the risks that you're going to want to avoid in the final product. And of course, the last thing has been this big health paradigm that's happened with the shift to telemedicine. And with some of the reimbursement coming aboard, you know that's going to give incentive for more wearable devices.